Hello, boys and girls. Back to Mrs. Piggle Wiggle. This time we're on chapter 3, and it's called The Bully. Nicholas, was 10 years old. He was a husky boy, very strong and large for his age. All parents like to have large, healthy children, and Mr. and Mrs. would have been very proud of Nicholas, except for one thing. One shameful thing. Nicholas was a bully. He hit children littler than he was. He teased and hit girls. He teased and hit puppy dogs. He scared cats. He even threw stones at birds. And once he tipped over the stroller of a 1-year-old baby left outside the grocery store. You see him? Not a nice kid. For a long time, Mr. and Mrs. didn't know about Nicholas. They knew he was large for his age. They knew his friendships with other children didn't last very long. They knew he had not been asked to several birthday parties, but they thought that Nicholas was big and strong and handsome and needed older, more intelligent children to play with. In fact, just the night before this story opens, after Nicholas had kicked the cat, stepped on Josephine the dog's tail, and gone swaggering up to bed, Mrs. said to Mr. Forthright, have you noticed how fine and big and strong little Nicky has grown? Mr. who was reading about stocks and bonds in the evening paper, said, Sure outgrows his shoes fast. 2 new pairs last month. I know, said Mrs. dreamily. His feet are just enormous. They're almost as big as yours. Good, said Mr. brightening up. Maybe he can wear out those oxblood brogues I got in Chicago last winter. They never did fit, and I paid a lot for them. Do boys wear brogues? Asked Mrs. What difference does it make? Said Mr. They're shoes, and they're new. After all, Abe Lincoln went barefoot. But Forthright dear, said Mrs. anxiously, Nicky is a patrol boy, and he needs new patrol boots. Nonsense, said Mr. Shoes are shoes. They're only meant to keep your feet off the cold ground. The next morning, rather hesitantly, Mrs. went into Nicholas's room, carrying the large, sturdy brogues. She said, Look what Daddy got in Chicago, dear. Nicholas took one of the shoes, examined it carefully, then to his mother's surprise said, Zowie, what strong shoes! Can I wear them to school today? I was thinking more of Sunday school, said his mother, but I guess one day at school won't matter. Nicholas, who was still in his pajamas, slipped a bare foot into one of the shoes. He smiled happily. Kind of big, but boy, they're strong and heavy. Mrs. heaved a sigh of relief and went downstairs to make the pancakes. When Nicholas came clumping into breakfast, Mr. said, New shoes, eh, son? Yeah, said Nicholas, new and strong, and I bet if I kicked with these old shoes, it would just about break somebody's leg. Mr. who was reading the paper and not listening, said, Mrs. who was turning the pancake, said, How many sausages, Nicky dear? 10 sausages and 14 pancakes, said Nicholas, gulping down his orange juice. My, what a big, strong, hungry boy you are, said his mother happily. Then breakfast was over, and Nicholas had gone clumping off to school in his new shoes that really didn't fit, and Mr. had left for the office in his new shoes that did, and Mrs. poured herself a hot cup of coffee and sat down at the telephone to call up her friends. She had finished talking to Mary Hex when the telephone rang. It was little Roscoe Eager's mother, and she was so mad she was choking. She said, Carlotta, if you don't do something about that big bully, I'm going to call the sheriff. What big bully? Asked Mrs. innocently. What big bully? Shrieked Mrs. Eager. You know perfectly well what big bully. I don't either, said Mrs. I don't know any big bullies. Oh, yes you do, said Mrs. Eager, because the meanest, biggest, cruelest bully in the whole United States is your own son, Nicholas. You mean my Nicky? Asked Mrs. Yes, you're Nicky, said Mrs. Eager. This morning on his way to school, he kicked little Roscoe in the shins with his big new shoes. And now Roscoe's home lying on the couch with bandages clear up to his knees, and his legs are still bleeding. And for all I know, both leg bones are shattered. How horrible, wailed Mrs. Semicolon. How terrible. Shall I call the doctor? I already have, said Mrs. Eager coldly. He's on his way over. But what I want to know is what you intend to do about Nicholas. I'll punish him, of course, said Mrs. Semicolon, but I just can't understand it. It doesn't sound a bit like Nicky. But it does, said Mrs. Eager. It sounds exactly like him. Hitting children littler than he is, kicking dogs, jerking toys away from babies, tipping over little girls' tricycles, pulling cats' tails. Now I have to go. I hear Roscoe moaning for me. Jessie, dear, I'm so sorry, said Mrs. Semicolon. I'll come right over and bring some coloring books and some sugar cookies I baked yesterday. At first, after she hung up the phone, Mrs. Semicolon cried a little. Then she remembered the new shoes, blew her nose, wiped her eyes, and called Mr. Semicolon. When he answered, she said angrily, Well, I hope you're happy. About what? He asked. Mrs. Semicolon began to cry. It's those darned old shoes that didn't fit Nicky anyway, she sobbed. Oh, what in the world is the matter? Asked Mr. Semicolon. So Mrs. Semicolon told him about Mrs. Eager's phone call. Mrs. Semicolon said, It never would have happened if it wouldn't have been for those shoes. I'm going to give them to Goodwill. Mr. Semicolon said, Listen to me, Carlota, dear. It is not the shoes that are at fault. It is Nicky. After all, the shoes didn't grab his feet and force them to kick a little boy in the shins, did they? Oh, no, I guess not, sniffed Mrs. Semicolon. Well then, said Mr. Semicolon, the important thing is not the kind of shoes he kicked with, it's the fact that he kicked, and a boy smaller than he. Isn't that right, dear? Yes, said Mrs. Semicolon. Well then, said Mr. Semicolon, when young Nicholas comes home from school, you send him up to his room to think things over, and I will deal with him when I come home. Then Mrs. Semicolon remembered about kicking the dogs, jerking toys away from babies, tipping over little girls' tricycles, pulling cats' tails. So she said, But kicking with those shoes isn't the only thing. Forthright, Mrs. Eager also told me, and she told him all the rest of Nicky's bad actions. When she'd finished, Mr. Semicolon said, Well, I won't have a bully for a son. I think I'll go over to school right now and deal with that young man. What will you do? Asked Mrs. Semicolon faintly. There was a pause, quite a long pause on the other end of the wire. Then Nicky's father said, Why don't you call Mrs. Piggle? Oh, Forthright, how clever of you, said Nicky's mother. I'll call her right away. She'll know just what to do. She always does. We'll read more later to find out what Mrs. Piggle suggests they do with that mean old bully, Nicky.